So the main focus of this panel is going to be around how do we think corporate venturing needs to evolve into the future. Corporate venturing 3.0, as some organizations are calling it, and how we move forward in making it more strategic. When I run panels, I want to get questions from the audience very early on in this. So after I've done my short introduction and each of the panelists have introduced themselves and the angle they're coming from, we're going to come to you for questions. So please be prepared. We're not going to wait until the end of our session for doing this. So by way of introduction, what do we mean by corporate venturing 3.0? I think from what I've seen over the last 15 years, I think corporate venturing and how organizations think about innovation and venturing starts off by recognizing you need to do some innovation. And caricaturing it, your chief executive might come back from Davos saying, I sat next to a chief executive who's got a corporate venturing unit, it looks like it's fantastic, we want to do something like that. Corporate venturing 2.0, after you've been on the academy and you get started in running your venture unit, you get some success, you survive for more than the 2.5 or 3 years that a corporate venturing unit manages to survive, and you've been doing some investments. But I would caricature that phase where probably a lot of corporate venture units are at the moment. They're doing ad hoc investments, they've got a portfolio of investments, but they're still not shifting the dial strategically. Where I think corporate venturing 3.0 is, and where a number of these panels are now really panel members are now trying to address it, is they recognize they need to string together different startups, different technologies to address a new business model. And certainly like one of the corporates that was involved in our Palo Alto program in January, after they'd done the 2-day program, working for a massive US-based corporate, predominantly said, we've got an $18 billion opportunity we're not addressing at the moment because we haven't strung together a new business model around this new technology that's out there. So I don't see that corporates are going to necessarily, some of these corporates here, we're still going to need lubricants in our cars, we're still going to need health products. The core business isn't necessarily going to die, but my hypothesis and view is we're missing massive opportunities at the moment in how we build strategic new opportunities by stringing together technology. So that's the hypothesis. We would like the panel on that to give their perspectives on, and we'd also like your perspectives on that as well. So I'd like to get the panel to introduce themselves, and we'll start on the end, Jonathan.
So I'm Jonathan from BP. We've actually got two ventures teams at BP, the one that Kira spoke yesterday. But the team I run, it's more around using the legacy presence of the brands. So Castrol, one of the master brands at BP, and how we can translate that into new sectors for us. So building on the insight that we have through our marketing teams and sales teams, to understand what our role ought to be in the future as all our customer segments change. And so we tend to invest around themes and then try and understand what is then missing. If you piece together some companies in there, what we need to go off and build to kind of stitch it all together.
Thank you. Sarah.
Good morning, Sarah Fisher. I work with External Innovation in Johnson & Johnson, primarily focused on medical device technologies. In global markets. So the way we're looking at this now is actually to take a deep look internally and externally as we move away from just the treatment paradigm to also the wellness paradigm. And in that sense, we need to take a look at the assets we have internally across consumer products, pharmaceutical products, and medical device products to see if we can combine new offerings. And then also leads us to look externally to both traditional healthcare strategics, other complementary investors, as well as non-traditional healthcare companies and strategics that might be technology entrants in our space to identify where we have capability gaps and where we maybe can, as Andrew says, string along new capabilities to provide new offerings into the market.
Thank you. Phil?
So I'm Phil Giesler. I run a group focusing on long-range and disruptive innovation at British American Tobacco, a new team set up about 18 months ago. Clearly, the smoking industry is a very controversial industry, and as people realize the impacts of smoking on health, and you see declines in the traditional smoking market, you also see very, very new opportunities now step up in the whole area of vaping, or what we call next generation of products. To Andrew's point, they're very, very different value chains, very, very different value models, and our group is looking at how we transition our business to take advantage of that and to actually help people across that gap in their behavior and change.
Good. Pauline.
Hi, I'm Pauline from Singapore. I work for the National Research Foundation of the Prime Minister's Office. And I'm sort of a misfit in this panel because I'm not part of a corporate. But what we do is we actually help corporates develop in Singapore. We try and identify gaps in the country, and we see where we can help fill those gaps. So it really started last year when I came to GCV, the symposium last year, to find out more about what corporate venturing was about. It is really quite new in Singapore, so we've actually put in a program to pilot what it would be like if we would catalyze some of these innovation by some large corporations so that they would look at some innovative startups that could or would not fit into their business model. We hope that by helping to co-fund some of these programs, that they would, we would de-risk them and they would look beyond their usual business model for innovative ideas.
Good, thank you. And Pauline, I think you've certainly got a right to be on the panel. I think a very important part of what I'm seeing corporates are seeing now is that there's enough technology out there, there's probably too many incubators, and how do you really engage now with incubators and technology startups globally? And as a corporate, we can join those up rather than just being ad hoc type investments or just a regional area. So I think that's an important role of how corporates work with technology incubators like yourselves. So, any questions or any perspectives from the audience first in terms of what corporate venturing 3.0 is and how we're making change that you want to ask the panel? If you haven't, we can ask them, but any perspectives? Chris.
Hi. One of the interesting challenges is where is the next great idea going to come from, both geographically, both thematically, that will make a huge difference to your business. It's just impossible to know. One of the great gifts that we've been given in our age is the democratization of technology, democratization of entrepreneurship. It could come from anywhere. How do you think about that in terms of scoping the world?
Good. I'm going to ask for some more questions so that the panel can be thinking about that while we get any more questions. Well, Chris has broken the ice and come up with one. Yep, over here. Just briefly introduce yourself.
Good morning, my name is Jonathan Marks. I have a question about the role that digital storytelling can play in getting this message out, because in my work with scale-up companies, I notice they're very good at explaining what they do and terrible at explaining about why it's important. And that's very important for investors.
Good question. I think how you tell that story of what the future is going to be in terms of the business, I think is going to be important as well. And so I know the panel have got some perspectives on that. Any other questions? Come on, are you still all asleep after drinking all that wine last night? Okay, we'll come back to you on that in a moment. So who'd like to start and do some of the stories about your current things, stories you're telling? Who'd like to?
I can give just actually one thing, which just to answer the question on storytelling. It's very interesting that you mentioned that. In our business, and I think it also addresses the first point, we're very keen on trying to understand what does the future look like? Where are the future directions for an industry like ours? And they could be in very, very many different ideas. I mean, our sector is fascinating in many ways. You talk about difficult subjects, you talk about addiction, you talk about nicotine, you talk about vaping, you talk about social, all of that. We've actually found that in helping our corporate executives understand that storytelling becomes a very, very powerful tool for us. And in fact, our major interactions on the West Coast in California, funnily enough, have not been in Northern California at the venture end in San Francisco in your offices. It's actually been down with the entertainment industry in Southern California, where an awful lot of people are talking about looking at the future. We work with a group called Sci Futures that actually tries to paint future scenarios of what a world could look like and what disruptive change could bring to that. And we find by telling stories in that sense, it actually opens our minds and opens our executives' minds in a way that just factual recounting can't actually do. So it's a very specific answer to a question, but we find it a very, very powerful mechanism to elicit change in our company.
We'd like to address those next questions. Jonathan, a story about Zoo?
We're not any that much dissimilar in a way. I mean, we have to define a boundary of where we can operate, where we can think, otherwise it would be endless, and that's usually defined more by our customers and our understanding of how their problems are shifting and changing, or an opportunity starting to emerge. I mean, the one big theme for us is connectivity and mobility. The rise of the electric vehicle. Yes, that's a different source of power, but people, the way you travel has to change at the minute, and until we get every electric vehicle capable of doing 400 or 500 miles, you have to make decisions around how you travel. So we start asking ourselves and customers and people around, well, what challenge does that represent? And so whether your commute is maybe a 80, 90 mile commute for some people, you can't do that reliably in an electric vehicle yet. And so the consequences of that are somebody being stationary for 20 minutes while they do a rapid recharge. That has an impact on retail. We're starting to think about, well, the rise of the autonomous vehicle. I mean, it was easy to predict mass adoption of cars when Ford first did its low-cost production line. What they didn't predict was the consequence of Walmart and the out-of-store or out-of-town shopping centres, shopping malls. Right? So with the rise of autonomous vehicles, we may not actually need to visit shopping malls anymore. So how's that going to change the urban landscape? So that's kind of how we set a theme, and then we work backwards to that to say, well, we create future scenarios, depict what that is, and then we just have to run with one we think is going to be most likely to happen on balance. It's never going to be exact science, and then we'll make a few strategic bets, if you like, on working with a company or taking a seat on that board, because more to get the insight around where's the pull coming from for that business. Is it really solving a problem, or is that problem not here yet? And that's really how we invest around that, to get a really good understanding of how a particular opportunity or sector or market need is evolving.
So I think one of the examples, and Michael, we're talking in terms of a story, is that your investment in Zuby and what you've done with RepairPal and what you've done in Malaysia. I think that helps to address Chris's point as well, that certainly I've worked with you and Castrol before, where we've looked at technologies in China, you've done it in other parts of the world, and I think how you've strung together those different startups and thought of how the relationship with the customer and these in-car diagnostics, give us a little bit of an insight on that one.
Yeah, so I mean, this sort of touched on that storytelling piece. I mean, I think so when, as a team, we got going back in 2012, when you start talking to your senior management team, the thing they know best is the existing business. So you can't stray too far from that is your first kind of foray into doing new business development, the venturing. So within Castrol, I mean, the thing they know obviously really well is automotive. And so one of the things we started to explore is with the rise of digital technologies, we're really used to booking car taxis, Uber or OpenTable, I think just by the click of the phone. What wasn't happening yet is something goes wrong with the car communicating with you in a way that says, this is what I need, or I am going to need this in a few weeks, and empowering us as consumers with information around, okay, this is what's gone wrong, this is what needs to happen, this is how much you can expect to cost to repair it, this is where you ought to go to get it fixed, these are your choices, click here, book, pay, get it done really, really simply. And we said, well, there's no technological reason why that shouldn't take place, so what was preventing that from happening? So the first company we worked with, Andrew mentioned, was in San Francisco, RepairPal. You put your zip code in, make a model, and it would give you that information, but it wouldn't do anything other than provide recommendations of where to go to get your car fixed. So we didn't know how workshops would react to that. We didn't know how consumers would react to that. So it was, let's invest, work with them to see and understand from that. In reality, it turns out consumers are responding to it pretty well, and there's like nearly 5 million consumers a month now go to that platform. The challenge was when we thought next step is, well, most people don't know what they need when they go to a site like that and say, they might say, I need tires, I need brakes, or whatever. But if it's more complicated than that, they don't know. But the car usually does to some extent. So if we could automate the way that data could come out of the vehicle and do some rudimentary diagnostics on that data, then we should be able to make that recommendation automatically ahead of time. Right? So that was investment in Zuby that we did, again, just to more around learning. It was how do you get those devices in volume into consumers' cars without it being a cumbersome cost, right? And that's just starting to evolve. And then the next step was around us deciding, well, that works in the US. What do consumers and the market react in the same way in Asia, right? And so we designed a test. And this time it was something we built ourselves, just a digital platform, having gained learning and insight from the existing investments that we've made.
Yeah, so actually Jonathan spoke about that on a webinar we did last week, and we can make that available to you if you want that. Sarah, can you give some insights from the health perspective, and particularly
Yeah.
like the examples we did at McLaren?
Well, just listening to the two previous examples, I think what we're seeing in most industries based on the rise of the importance of digital is the consumer empowerment theme. Yeah. And so that's happening everywhere. And what that means is that, in healthcare we used to speak about treatment and patients. And now it's the consumer of healthcare, which means we talk about everything from healthy living all the way to follow-up, maybe from post-surgical treatment. So if you take the total paradigm, which maybe starts on the left with healthy living, then goes to identification and interception and prevention, diagnosis. So you're moving from pre-onset of disease, how do you identify people before they even have disease via biomarkers, et cetera, to then all the way post-surgical treatment. You see companies like ours moving away from where we used to focus just on the far right. And because of the theme of consumer empowerment and now also healthcare reform measures, as well as the influx of non-traditional healthcare players and digital and technology, companies like ours that are traditional healthcare players, large multinationals, we don't have all the capabilities to be able to deliver on the left-hand side of that paradigm, right? So we don't have everything we need under one roof, despite the large size, to be able to put the right solutions and offerings in the market. So we need to look for other investors, other strategics, other startups, throughout the entire ecosystem to try to string along how do we put together an offering. And it doesn't mean that we have to own all parts of that offering also. So it could be that we can say, okay, do we understand what the business model is and what a solution offering or a business model should be for a solution offering along each one of the steps of this treatment paradigm? And if we don't, that's also fine. But then how do we work alongside other partners to explore that? And should we own and just spend our own money to try to figure out and stumble all over ourselves to kind of get to that solution? Or should we work with other players who have that capability, who have already invested in that capability and say, hey, why don't we just add our assets onto your capability and let's see what happens in market and test that together? Because I think we're all trying to figure out, how to play in the wellness side of the space or the prevention side, and is there a way to capture revenue out of that? Is there a value proposition that makes sense for players like us? Or should we leave that to others? And those are the questions we're still trying to define. And in order to do that, you can't be insular in your thinking.
Yeah, and you've got to try and engage the corporate on understanding how they're going to change their model for these incremental areas.
Right.
So Pauline, looking at it from a technology incubator perspective, how are you positioning Singapore and working with your startups, your areas, your government and corporates?
Well, I think if you say that from a technology incubator point of view, I think like the NRF works sort of like an incubator. So what Chris said about how do you know what sort of technology areas you want for Singapore, I think that we do a lot of that. It's a lot of crystal balling and it's very challenging, especially for a resource-strapped small country like Singapore. We can't do everything and we can't predict what's going to be good for us, whether it's good for us or for the global market. We can't predict that. So we do a lot of consultation sessions and we can't do this alone. So we do a lot of this with corporates, even with startups and some of the institutes of higher learning. So say for example now, before we came up with our 5-year plan, we actually spent about 1.5 years working with many parts of the country to identify at least like 4 main areas of focus. And within the main areas of focus, there's also areas that we want to promote. So say for example, in the last 10 years or so, healthcare was sort of dealt with in 2 different parts. There was an economic part and health management part. Then we realized as the country developed that we couldn't do these as 2 separate parts because some of the things that we were developing, like medical technologies, were really from an economic point of view, how it would actually bring open new markets for Singapore. But then we realized that part of the budget had to go into sort of more healthcare and quality management for our people as well. So this sort of crystal balling and road mapping has to be done concurrently, and we actually do this in many phases. So it really, I have to admit, it really isn't easy, and oftentimes it is quite painful. Sometimes you have to say that, okay, we're going to drop this because we can't do it anymore. Or even if we want to do something futuristic, it sounds really exciting, like autonomous vehicles. We have to know what sort of resources we have, the reality of who we can work with, and even decisions on what do we develop ourselves versus what do we buy. So it's really it's an incremental, ongoing effort. Yeah.
Good. Any more questions on that before we move on to some other areas? Has that prompted any thoughts on that from you around health or technologies now that these organisations are dealing with? They're still asleep, guys. So, just building on some of the points you were saying in terms of how are you seeing these new business models going back into your organisation? Because you've described how you're doing new things in cars, how you're trying to move on to that different part of the wellness sort of type spectrum. How are you feeling that change into the organisation to make it strategic rather than just making it an interesting project or just making it a financial return? How are you addressing that? What are the challenges you're making at the moment?
Well, I think for us, I mean, the really interesting thing for us is if you look at the growth of the vaping and the e-cigarette market. When I was working in California investing 10 years ago, we saw the first companies in that space, normal small startups, a very fragmented industry. It's now grown into something like a $5 billion global industry. So for businesses like ours, that gains a lot of attention. And indeed, we're very active in that space. But the thing that's really challenging for us is, to your point, Andrew, really understanding where is the value in the chain as far as that market is concerned. It's a very, very different market than the traditional product mix that we make. It's a market that's much more prone to advertising, and also not just about the manufacturers and the people that actually make the brands. It's actually about retailers, it's about vaping bars, it's about flavors, it's about high degrees of innovation. And so one of the challenges we've had as an organization is working out where we actually want to play and where we actually want to be involved in helping to basically make that a profitable industry as it consolidates going forward. The other fly in the ointment as far as an industry like ours, of course, is concerned is the role of government. Because in our traditional sectors, the role of government and excise plays a massive part in deciding who gets value, who makes profit. In this area, as you would have probably realized, it's a very, very hot area at the moment in terms of health legislation, in terms of government interaction, in terms of consumer understanding. And different governments take different attitudes towards that kind of revenue stream and that degree of regulation. So we have to be very, very agile of being able to understand what that means for us in terms of where we actually want to play. So the way we actually look at that is clearly it's an industry that is very, very central to our strategy going forward, but we have to work out how to play in different areas, and we use a variety of M&A, partnering, minority stake tools in order to try different experiments in different parts of the world and learn from that.
Mm-hmm. Perspectives into your organisation, Sarah?
Yeah, I'd say, I guess, two things. One is we hold, let's say we're centered around a concept around, let's explore what we would do for a full treatment paradigm in any kind of disease area. Then we bring together what we call a lab concept. And so it'll be other strategics, it might be payers, whether insurance companies, private or public, government officials, patient advocacy groups, other non-traditional healthcare players, design thinking, you name it. We bring them in and we say, okay, here's what we're thinking. So before we even put something in market to pilot it or test it, we do a lab concept to try to bring in divergent thoughts and perspectives to kind of shape it and give it a little bit more teeth before we bring it into market and test it. And then in order to get an idea around the value proposition of that early on, similarly, I think the role of the payer is extremely important to us. I know if there's no if there's no value for this in any market, then there's no sense in really developing it unless we're doing something philanthropically, which of course we also do. But in these cases, I would say we work and we look at countries and markets also to say, okay, what's the most attractive healthcare system for us to be able to get early feedback and test this value proposition, and where are we going to get the most direct feedback from? So it's not necessarily the players that look the most attractive on paper in terms of size of market or size of healthcare system or importance, et cetera. But if there's too many layers of bureaucracy, if honestly the culture of a particular country is not to give direct feedback, I'd prefer not to go there initially to test the concept. Because for us, as everybody else, our time and money and resources are limited. And if we're trying to introduce a new concept, into the market, we don't really have time to waste or stumble across a situation where we can't really get honest feedback from where we need it most. So I tend to look at markets and countries also as a way to accelerate the pace of new business offerings by selecting the right healthcare systems in which to test the value proposition early.
Yeah, and I've certainly seen that. I think the academy running in China, Intel, they're doing their health developments and that in China because the systems in the West, the US and Europe, and that is very difficult to do the developments, and the scale opportunities are so much bigger in that there as well. As sort of one example of picking a region, which I think corporates can be very good at doing, whereas individual VCs or startups could be very locally focused. And certainly I've worked with MediCity in Nottingham, and they spend their time trying to sell into the local hospital trust, which is a very long, difficult process and only getting one sort of small pilot. So I think it's important for corporates have got that opportunity to think globally in that. Jonathan, can you give some insights in how you engage some of your executives in changing attitudes? And
all right, more around the business model. I mean, we've got one of the businesses we have internally is in the marine industry. So we sell obviously fuel and oil to the big ocean-going shipping companies. And there's about 80,000 vessels which consume more than $1 million worth of fuel alone. So it's quite a substantial operating cost for those shipping companies. So as BP, we've always positioned ourselves as a premium supplier and premium sort of products into that sector. And what happens is the more that the industries go to electronic procurement, it's harder for you as a premium supplier to sort of stand out, and you're trying to address your margin through that premiumization. You end up rapidly being kicked out of procurement processes. And so we needed to change pretty quickly about, well, how can we do something differently, which changed the business model away from just a price per liter of a fluid. So we deliberately went out and we found an artificial intelligence company in Denmark, which had a piece of software that pulled in data from a couple of off-the-shelf sensors you put on a vessel. And it relayed in real time back to the captain about how to better position the ship in the water to maximize the efficiency. And so we quickly realized that actually the fuel savings and the oil savings in dollars terms was going to be greater than the cost of some of the things that we'd be selling. So why don't we actually, rather than supply, as a concept, just some element of those fluids and charge them, why don't we charge for software? Because the margin on that we're going to make is greater, and that'll more than pay for the cost of them purchasing our products. So in a way, and forgive me, I'm not a marketeer, right? I don't say buy the software first and you get oil for free, but that's in essence what they were getting. But it did mean that we could completely change away from that electronic procurement process and going into the CFO's office and saying, you spend $1.3 million a year on fuel and oil with us. So actually, if you'd like to take off a few $100,000 of that, why don't you continue to buy our products, but buy this software as well?
Yeah, but I think the areas we're working in terms of the value chain stuff is around mobility, around health. But one of the examples in the energy sector we've been working is the likes of Google Nest, with now the thermostat in the home, energy management, home security, home health, or health of people sort of in that home. You could see the scenario where the person who's got that Nest, where if they get the control of that value chain, the understanding of the consumer, they could be giving away what was the traditional product or commodity as free as part of that, or it lowers considerably what the actual physical input in that is, because software eats our businesses. Yeah. Pauline, in terms of getting corporates to come and see the technologies, the new business models and stuff like that, where are you working with corporates to get them to Singapore and get that wow factor? Because certainly, we've been working with McLaren, and they've got a number of teams in that there now because of the support they get from Singapore government, but also get that wow factor. Where are you working with corporates to do that?
So we actually are trying to work very hard on this. So to your point about new business models, so we recently just awarded 4 large corporations in Singapore. So one of these, I'll give an example. So this is one of it that could actually illustrate how we were changing their perception of investing into innovative startups. So this was actually a traditional retail mall. So their business is like a developer. They develop mall spaces and rent those out. We spoke to them a year ago, and they were not really willing to go into corporate venturing. But in a short space of 6 months, when all this e-commerce, online marketing took over, they realized that their traditional brick and mortar retail business could possibly be displaced by all this new, the digital economy. So they came to us and they said, you know, is there something we can, could the Singapore government help in such a way? And of course, being a large corporation, they weren't looking for funding, because I don't think that the amount of money we could give them would create a dent in their annual turnover. But what they needed was to be connected to the network of innovative startups, SMEs, to a global network of people like yourselves. And we said, okay, I mean, that's something that we could probably do, because we've been sort of in the innovation space for some time. And for a retail business, a classical retail business, it is pretty daunting for them to start from zero. And so their proposal to us actually looked pretty promising in the sense that they were willing to explore beyond their regular business models. Even, you know, interestingly, they set up like 8 innovation centers on their own, because they want to engage with people in new building materials, energy saving, even like stuff that would, you know, online long stay, short stay concepts, not necessarily like Airbnb, but other kinds of methods of, you know, hospitality. So that to me was really interesting, and I thought that, you know, that's actually a lot what we do for corporates when we work with them. It's not so much just about the co-funding, it's more about how we could create new market opportunities for them and create opportunities for them to link up with small startups, with universities, and with other companies. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Good. So I think the panel have illustrated some of the approach that they've been doing. I know certain Jonathan's a veteran and Phil's a veteran around in these areas in their current and previous organisations, of how we're taking corporate venturing, how we're taking innovation to the next stage, particularly on how we join these things and that together. So I think it's important on covering that. So feel free to come and speak to me or speak to the panel around how we take corporate venturing into its new area and how we strategically link these things and that together to drive the change. A couple of sort of announcements. So apart from running Aim of Art and being the open innovation partner to lots of these corporates, as you know, we do the Academy, which Paul has given an introduction to. I'm also a quiz master, as you know, and that from last night. We've now got the numbers and that in, and the generosity of the people here last night, we've raised £1,135 so far, which is going to be donated, split between World Vision and Tech Fugees, which the Merck team decided as their charity for donating. So thank you all very much for your donation into those. One other sort of final little announcement is, if I haven't got enough on my plate, a number of you know that I've got 2 daughters, one who's 9 now and one who's 13. The 13-year-old 4 years ago was here at the conference. She'd done a sustainability project and had seen Al Gore's video, and her school project, she brought in and met Al and got it signed, and he was up on the stage here at the conference and sort of compliment. That was when she was 9. She's now 13 and becoming a right teenager and madam. The reason for the mentioning it is I've been a bit of a dad in getting them to do entrepreneurial things, and a number of you have bought things like plants for charity and lavender bags and stuff like that, and a number of the people that I work with in the work said, oh wow, I wish I could get my kids to do that. So we're now going to be launching, I've got a colleague in my team at Amovar who's launching Upstarts for Startups. So it's an opportunity for children to bring along their parents, their aunts, uncles, their grandparents even, to come along. So it'll be for 9 to 13-year-olds. We're going to do the first one in London. Teach the kids about how they develop some products, how they launch and sell them. My 9-year-old has got a YouTube video channel on that already, so I'm learning things from her on how she's doing that, so I expect the parents to learn things. So we're going to do our first one in London on the 9th of July. If any of you are interested in that or got kids that want to be inspired, or grandkids or nephews and nieces, then let us know about that, and we'll be keen to get you involved in that as well. So thank you very much to the panel for their input.